Hey everyone, welcome back to the realm. I'll be your guide beyond Waking Realm. Today, we're diving into the meaning behind Higgs Monaghan, the man who chose the end. Today we're discussing Higgs Monaghan. Before we begin, I do want to mention that while this narrative dive explores Higgs as we knew him in the original Death Stranding, the footage you're seeing comes from the Death Stranding 2. Rather than revisiting the original game, I wanted to continue using this world as a backdrop while looking back at the characters who helped shape it. And yes, we're on the beach. If you know, you know. At first glance, Higgs seems almost larger than the world around him. The golden mask, the confidence, the theatrics, the ability to summon BTs, and manipulate forces that most people can barely comprehend, let alone control. Every time Higgs appears, he carries himself like someone who already knows how the story ends. And everyone else is simply taking too long to catch up. But Higgs wasn't exactly the man in the golden mask. Before the terrorism, before Homo Demens, and before he stood beside an Extinction Entity, believing humanity's end was inevitable, Higgs was a porter. He carried supplies. He helped people. He crossed a fractured America, connecting isolated communities in a world where simply stepping outside could mean confronting death. And somewhere along that journey, the way Higgs saw humanity changed. That's where I think his character becomes far more interesting than the charismatic antagonist we meet through Sam. Because Higgs doesn't simply believe that extinction is coming, he reaches a point where he embraces it. Where rebuilding seems meaningless, connection appears temporary, and humanity's struggle to survive becomes little more than delaying an ending he believes has already been decided. So what happened? How does someone who once traveled the world helping people survive eventually become someone willing to help bring out their extinction? Beneath all the confidence, cruelty, and power Higgs surrounds himself with, how much of the man he used to be was actually left behind? To understand the man in the golden mask, we first have to understand the man who existed before it. Before Higgs became the person we meet in Death Stranding, his relationship with the world was already being shaped by isolation. Much of what we learn about his earlier life comes through the journals he left behind. And what they reveal is someone whose familiarity with death began long before he ever decided to embrace extinction. Higgs was raised by his uncle after losing his parents at a young age, but the home he was left with wasn't exactly a place of comfort. His uncle was abusive, controlling, and kept him largely isolated from the world outside. For Higgs, connection wasn't something he could simply take for granted, and eventually that isolation ended violently. Higgs killed his uncle. But what happened afterward may have been just as important as the act itself. His uncle's death brought Higgs into contact with something he didn't fully understand yet: the beach. His dooms began to manifest more clearly, giving him a connection to death that most people around him could never experience in the same way. And I think this is an important place to stop for a moment. Because it would be easy to look at Higgs's childhood and use it as a convenient explanation for the person he eventually becomes. He was abused. He was isolated. He killed his uncle. Therefore, somewhere inside him, the villain was already there. But people aren't equations. Pain doesn't automatically create cruelty, and trauma doesn't predetermine what someone will become. What Higgs's past gives us instead is context. Before he ever met Amelie, before he gained the power we associate with the man in the golden mask, Higgs had already learned that the people closest to you could be a source of pain. He had already experienced isolation, and now, through dooms, even death itself was becoming something unusually close to him. Yet despite all of that, Higgs didn't immediately turn his back on humanity. He became a porter. And there's something almost painfully ironic about that. A child who has spent so much of his life isolated eventually chose a profession built around crossing that isolation for other people. As a porter, Higgs traveled between communities, carrying the things people needed to survive: food, medicine, supplies, small pieces of a world that could no longer easily reach one another. Whatever Higgs eventually came to believe about humanity, there was a point in his life when he was still participating in its survival. He was still helping, and that's important because it means the person we eventually meet wasn't inevitable. Something still had to change. The question is no longer whether Higgs understood isolation or death. He understood both intimately. The question is what eventually convinced him that helping people endure either of them was no longer worth it. Becoming a porter gave Higgs something his childhood rarely offered him: a reason to step beyond isolation. But being a porter in this world also meant seeing humanity at its most vulnerable. Every delivery existed because someone, somewhere, couldn't survive entirely on their own. Communities depended on people willing to cross territory filled with BTs, timefall, and the constant possibility that one wrong encounter could end in another void out. For some, that dependence might reinforce the importance of connection. For Higgs, it seems to have gradually reinforced something else: how fragile all of it was. His Doom's abilities continued to develop, and with them came a greater sensitivity to the world of the dead. Higgs wasn't simply delivering packages through dangerous territory anymore. He could sense BTs, understand them in ways ordinary people couldn't, and increasingly exist closer to that boundary between life and death. At first, he used those abilities to help. That's something worth remembering about Higgs. His power wasn't always something he used to dominate people. There was a time when being different made him a more capable porter. It allowed him to travel where others couldn't and survive dangers that would otherwise make connecting communities nearly impossible. And for a while, Higgs even tried to build something from that. He formed his own porter organization, attempting to expand the work he was already doing and help more people scattered across the world. But the more Higgs tried to help, the more he was exposed to just how overwhelming that responsibility could become. There would always be another person who needed something, another community barely surviving, another journey through territory where death was waiting. And Higgs couldn't save everyone. That realization seems to have mattered to him. Because there's a difference between knowing that people die and repeatedly confronting how little power you have to prevent it. For someone like Higgs, someone whose dooms already made death feel unusually close, being a porter may have given him purpose, but it also forced him to repeatedly confront the limits of that purpose. No matter how many deliveries he completed, the world remained broken. No matter how many people he helped, more people still needed saving. And no matter how capable he became, death never stopped following close behind. Then Higgs encountered Fragile. In many ways, Fragile represented an opportunity for Higgs to continue doing exactly what he had already been trying to accomplish. Fragile Express had the resources and infrastructure his own operation lacked, and Higgs eventually joined her organization. For a time, the two were working toward the same fundamental goal, keeping people connected in a world designed to pull them apart. And that's what makes what happens between them later so revealing. Because the Higgs standing beside Fragile wasn't yet the man forcing her to walk through Timefall. He was still a porter, still connecting people, still participating in the same struggle for survival that he would eventually come to ridicule. But underneath that purpose, Higgs was already wrestling with a question that his work could never completely answer. How many people do you have to save before you can finally believe you're making a difference? For Higgs, there may never have been a number large enough. And when someone eventually appeared who could offer him power beyond anything he had experienced before, that feeling of helplessness was about to become something very different. Then Higgs met Amelie, and this is where the direction of his life begins to change dramatically. Because Amelie didn't simply offer Higgs more power. She offered him something that may have been even more intoxicating. Certainty. Until this point, Higgs had spent years living unusually close to death. He could sense BTs, his dooms connected him to the beach. His work as a porter repeatedly exposed him to people struggling to survive in a world that seemed determined to erase them. But knowing that death surrounds you is very different from being told that extinction itself is inevitable. Through Amelie, Higgs was no longer looking at humanity's suffering as a problem that might someday be overcome. He was standing beside an extinction entity. The end wasn't theoretical anymore. It had a face. And as Higgs's connection with Amelie deepened, so did his abilities. The power we eventually associate with him, the control over BTs, his command of the beach, and the almost supernatural authority with which he carries himself, was amplified through his connection to her. Think about what that might have meant for someone like Higgs. For much of his life, he had been surrounded by circumstances he couldn't control. He couldn't control the home he was raised in. He couldn't stop people from needing help. He couldn't deliver enough supplies to repair an entire broken world. He couldn't defeat death simply by becoming a better porter. And then suddenly, he possessed power that made those limitations feel almost irrelevant. Higgs was no longer simply navigating a world shaped by the Death Stranding. He could manipulate parts of it. And I think this is where power begins doing more than changing what Higgs is capable of. It changes how he sees himself. The golden mask, the Egyptian imagery, the theatrical way he speaks, even the way he presents himself to Sam. All of it creates the image of someone who no longer sees himself as another survivor, struggling alongside everyone else. Higgs begins carrying himself like someone who stands above that struggle. Someone who knows the truth everyone else refuses to accept. Humanity is going extinct, and the end is inevitable. Then every bridge people build, every delivery they make, and every connection they restore can begin to look temporary, almost pointless. But there's a contradiction here that I don't think we should ignore. If Higgs truly believed nothing mattered because extinction was inevitable, why did he need to participate in it? Why terrorize cities? Why manipulate Fragile? Why confront Sam? Why become the face of an ending that supposedly didn't need his help to arrive? Because Higgs isn't passive in his nihilism. He needs to act on it. And perhaps that's because accepting extinction gave Higgs something that simply surrendering to it never could. A role. As a porter, Higgs was one person trying to keep a dying world alive. Beside Amelie, he could imagine himself as something much greater. Someone standing as the edge of humanity's final moment. Not as another victim of extinction, but as one of the people ushering it forward. That doesn't mean Amelie forced Higgs to become who he became. Higgs still made choices. He chose what to do with the power he was given. And those choices matter, especially when we look at what he eventually does to Fragile. Because Fragile had once stood beside Higgs as another porter trying to connect this broken world. Eventually, Higgs would force her to experience just how far away from that person he had become. If Amelie shows us what Higgs becomes when he's given extraordinary power, Fragile shows us what he chooses to do with it. And that's important, because Fragile wasn't some stranger standing in Higgs' way. She knew him before the golden mask became what the face he presented to the world. They had worked together. They had delivered supplies together. They had once participated in the same effort to keep people connected, which makes Higgs' betrayal of Fragile feel much more personal than simply attacking a rival organization. Higgs used Fragile Express to transport packages containing nuclear weapons, hiding what they actually were from the people carrying them. When Fragile discovered what was happening, she managed to prevent one of those bombs from destroying South Knot City. But Higgs didn't simply respond by trying to kill her. He punished her. He gave Fragile a choice. Allow the city to be destroyed, or save it by carrying the bomb herself through timefall. Fragile chose the city. She ran. And the timefall rapidly aged her body everywhere it touched, leaving behind the physical scars of the decision Higgs forced her to make. It's one of the cruelest things Higgs does in Death Stranding, but what makes the moment revealing isn't only the suffering he inflicts. It's the choice he gives her. Higgs could have simply killed Fragile. Instead, he created a situation where surviving meant paying a price. And in doing so, he placed Fragile inside the same kind of worldview he had come to embrace. A world where suffering is unavoidable, where every attempt to save something only creates another form of loss. But Fragile's decision doesn't prove what Higgs thinks it does. Because she still chooses to save people. She knows what the timefall will do to her. She understands the cost. And she runs away. That's where Fragile becomes more than someone Higgs victimizes. She becomes another contradiction to him. Higgs has increasingly come to see humanity's struggle against death as temporary and ultimately meaningless. Fragile doesn't need to believe that she can save everyone for saving these people to matter. She only needs to believe that the lives in front of her are worth the cost. And Higgs can't take that decision away from her. He can control the circumstances. He can make the choice horrific, and he can permanently change her body, but he cannot make Fragile choose the city's destruction. For someone who increasingly presents himself as though he understands exactly what humanity is, that people are fragile, desperate, and merely postponing the inevitable, Fragile demonstrates something his worldview leaves very little room for. Meaning doesn't have to come from persistence and surviving. Saving someone doesn't become meaningless simply because they will eventually die. And connection doesn't have to last forever to have mattered while it existed. That doesn't mean it erases what Higgs does to her. If anything, it makes his cruelty harder to dismiss. As the detached behavior of someone who simply believes extinction is closing, because Higgs makes it personal. He humiliates Fragile. He takes something they once shared, being porters, carrying packages, helping people survive, and twists it into a method of punishment. And perhaps that's one of the clearest indications of how far Higgs has moved from the person he once was. The porter who once carried what people needed to survive now uses deliveries to destroy them. The man who once crossed dangerous territory for other people forces Fragile to cross it because of him. And the person who once helped connect isolated communities now weaponizes those very connections against them. But Fragile survives, and more importantly, she doesn't become Higgs. She carries the scars of what he did to her without accepting the worldview behind it. Later, Sam will challenge Higgs on a much larger scale, but Fragile has already challenged something more fundamental. Higgs can force another person to suffer. He cannot decide what that suffering will mean to them. And then there's Sam. Throughout Death Stranding, Higgs treats Sam like an obstacle. Someone to provoke, someone to test. Someone whose journey across America needs to end before humanity can reconnect. But when we look beyond their roles as protagonists and antagonists, there's something interesting about putting these two men beside one another. Because Sam understands isolation too. He understands loss. He's a porter. He has dooms. He spends much of his life walking through a world filled with BTs, corpses, timefall, and reminders that death is never particularly far away. And Sam isn't exactly an optimist when we first meet him. He doesn't begin Death Stranding believing wholeheartedly in bridges or in some grand vision of reconnecting America. Quite the opposite. Sam keeps people at a distance. He avoids physical contact. He carries his own wounds. And when he's asked to reconnect a country he wants very little to do with, his first instinct isn't enthusiasm, it's resistance. That's what makes the contrast between Sam and Higgs more interesting than simply hope against nihilism. Neither man begins from some uncomplicated faith in humanity. Both know how painful connection can be. Both have reasons to withdraw from it. And both spend their lives walking through the remains of a world where humanity has already come frighteningly close to disappearing. But Sam keeps walking, not because he has proof that everything will work out, not because reconnecting America suddenly fixes every problem the Death Stranding created, and not because the people he saves will live forever. He keeps walking because the person awaiting at the end of the journey still matters. That's something Higgs' worldview increasingly struggles to account for. Higgs looks at humanity and sees an ending. Sam keeps encountering individuals. A person who needs medicine, someone waiting for food, a community that has been cut off, another porter who needs a hand. Taken individually, none of those acts defeats extinction. And that's exactly the point. They don't have to. Higgs seems to reach a place where meaning depends upon the outcome. If humanity is destined to disappear, then struggling to preserve it becomes pointless. Sam's journey gradually suggests something different. An action can matter even when it doesn't last forever. And that's remarkably similar to what Fragile already demonstrated when Higgs forced her through the timefall. She couldn't save everyone. Sam can't save everyone. Neither of them can make death disappear, but Higgs can't either. The difference is what each of them does with that limitation. Higgs responds to powerlessness by pursuing greater power. Sam spends much of the game carrying things. There's almost something absurdly simple about that contrast. Higgs can summon BTs. He can manipulate the beach. He can create spectacles of destruction that makes him appear almost godlike. And Sam's answer, most of the time, is to put another package on his back and keep moving. Well, that's precisely why Sam becomes such a threat to what Higgs believes. Every connection Sam restores is evidence that people will continue reaching for one another, even when struggle and life isn't guaranteed. Every person who joins the network is another person deciding that isolation doesn't have to be the final answer. And the further Sam travels, the harder it becomes for Higgs to simply stand back and allow extinction to prove him right. He interferes. He provokes him. He escalates. And eventually their conflict becomes deeply personal. Because by then, Sam isn't merely rebuilding the network. He's refusing the conclusion Higgs has built his identity around. And I think there's another layer to their relationship that's easy to miss beneath all of Higgs's theatrics. Sam possesses something Higgs has spent much of his life chasing one form or another. Significance without needing to stand above everyone else. Sam becomes important because people depend on him. Because he carries something from one person to another. Because despite his discomforts with connection, people gradually become part of his life. Higgs becomes important by making himself impossible to ignore. Through fear, through destruction, through the golden mask and the enormous power behind it. One man becomes significant through the connections he creates. The other increasingly tries to become significant through the connections he can control or destroy. And yet, for all the power Higgs possesses, there is something almost fragile about the identity he's constructed. Because much of what allows Higgs to stand above Sam was never entirely his. The BTs, his extraordinary connection to the beach, the power that allows him to carry himself like a god standing at the end of the world. All of it leads back to Amelie. And despite all the power Higgs possesses, Sam eventually forces him to confront something he has spent much of Death Stranding hiding behind the mask. Strip away all of that power. Sam is still Sam, but who is Higgs? And that question becomes much harder for Higgs to answer once Amelie makes something painfully clear. For all the power she gave him, Higgs was never the person she ultimately chose. Sam was. And I think that matters to Higgs far beyond simply losing to the protagonist. Because Higgs doesn't behave like someone who believes he was merely given a useful set of abilities. He carries himself like someone who believes those abilities mean something about him. That he has seen what others cannot. That he understands the truth of extinction while everyone else desperately clings to a future that isn't coming. And through Amelie, Higgs has been given the power to stand at the center of that ending. For someone who once experienced how powerless one person could be against an entire dying world, imagine what that transformation must have felt like. Higgs wasn't carrying packages anymore. He wasn't trying to save one settlement at a time. He was standing beside an extinction entity. He could command BTs. He could manipulate the beach. He could look at someone like Sam and genuinely appear untouchable. And somewhere within all of that, Higgs seems to develop a belief that he isn't simply participating in what comes next. He belongs there. He has been chosen for it, which makes Amelie's relationship with Sam a wound that power can't completely cover. Because Sam doesn't want what Higgs wants. Sam doesn't worship Amelie. He doesn't embrace extinction. He doesn't look at the power surrounding her and decide that standing beside it makes him greater than everyone else. And yet, Sam remains the person Amelie cares about. The person she waits for. The person she ultimately places her faith in. Higgs can have her power and still not have the one thing that power seems to promise him. Her choice. And suddenly, some of Higgs' fixation on Sam begins to feel different. Sam isn't the only porter ruining his plans. He's a reminder that Higgs' power may not mean what Higgs wants it to mean. There is almost something painfully human underneath that jealousy. Higgs spends so much of Death Stranding dismissing the value people place on their connections. Yet his own sense of importance becomes deeply entangled with his connection to Amelie. He believes humanity is foolish for desperately holding on to one another. But Higgs is holding on to something too. The belief that Amelie choosing him or needing him proves that he matters. And that's where the identity Higgs has constructed begins to reveal its weakness. Because if your sense of importance depends on being chosen, what happens when someone chooses somebody else? If your power proves that you're special, what happens when that power was only ever being given to you? And if you built yourself into the man standing beside the end of the world, what happens when the end of the world no longer needs you? For Higgs, that answer doesn't arrive all at once, and that's important. When Sam confronts him on the beach, Higgs is still dangerous. He still has access to extraordinary abilities, and the fight doesn't suddenly become a fair contest between two ordinary men, but gradually something changes. The spectacle begins to fall away. The supernatural forces that had defined so many of Higgs' encounters with Sam stop being the focus. And eventually, after these two men have thrown at one another, the confrontation becomes remarkably simple. They fight. No colossal BT towering over Sam. No enormous creature separating Higgs from the person he's trying to defeat. No grand display capable of making him appear like some untouchable force standing above everyone else. Eventually they're exhausted, bloodied, standing in the surf, and beating the hell out of each other on a beach. There's something almost perfect about that. Because for perhaps the first time in their conflict, the distance between Higgs Monaghan and the image Higgs has created for himself begins to disappear. Not because the game suddenly tells us that everything Amelie gave him has been taken away in that moment, but because none of it can prevent Higgs from eventually having to face Sam directly. Man to man, that's why I think the beach matters so much for Higgs. And yes, that's why we're standing here. Because this is where the man in the golden mask begins to look remarkably human. Higgs can summon BTs. He can manipulate forces Sam could never control in the same way. He can surround himself with imagery that makes him appear larger than the dying world around him. But none of those things can give Higgs what he actually wants from Amelie. And none of them can make Sam accept what Higgs believes. By the end of the confrontation, Sam is still Sam, still a porter, still someone carrying his scars, his losses, and the connections he has made along the way. And Higgs is still Higgs. He still has his beliefs. He still has his anger. He still has all the pain and experiences that brought him here. But the mythology surrounding him has been wounded, because extraordinary power was never proof that Higgs understood the world better than everyone else. It was never proof that extinction made him right. And most painfully, it was never proof that Amelie had chosen him over Sam. And maybe that's the answer to the question we asked before. Who is Higgs beneath all that power? He's the same person who was underneath it all along. A man who had experienced helplessness, found extraordinary power, and allowed that power to become evidence that his understanding of the world was right. A man who convinced himself that accepting the end made him stronger than the people still fighting against it. And a man who wanted to believe he had become, or he had been chosen, only to find himself standing on a beach across from the person Amelie actually chose. After Sam defeats him, Higgs is left with one more person waiting for him on the beach. Fragile. And I don't want to spend too much time examining what this moment means for her, because This is Higgs' story. What interests me here is what happens when the man who has spent so much time speaking about extinction finally finds himself confronted with the possibility of his own death. Because Higgs doesn't beg, he doesn't suddenly decide that death is terrifying. Now that he's the one staring directly at it. If anything, he seems willing to accept what fragile might do to him. And there's something important about that. For all of Higgs' contradictions, this isn't necessarily one of them. The man who spent so much of Death Stranding treating death as inevitable doesn't suddenly abandon that belief when his own life is placed on the line. Higgs has lost to Sam. The future he tried to usher forward hasn't arrived. The person whose connection to Amelie he could never replace has defeated him. And now he's standing before someone he personally betrayed, humiliated, and permanently scarred. If Fragile chooses to kill him, Higgs knows exactly why. There is no grand display left to hide behind, no audience he needs to impress, no victory waiting for him afterward. Just consequence. And Higgs appears prepared to meet it, but Fragile doesn't give him the ending he seems willing to accept. She leaves the choice of what comes next with him, and suddenly Higgs is confronted with something very different from the extinction he spent so much time embracing. He has to choose what to do with himself. That's an interesting place to leave someone like Higgs, because believing that everything will eventually end can make the future seem simple. If extinction is inevitable, then nothing has to be built. Nothing has to be repaired. Nothing has to be endured indefinitely. Eventually, the ending makes every decision for you. But surviving? Surviving means there is still a next moment, and another after that. It means living with failure. Living with what you've done. Living without the certainty that once made everything seem so simple. Maybe that's why Higgs' final moments in Death Stranding feel strangely appropriate. He spent so much of the story trying to help decide how humanity's story would end. And after everything, the power, the mask, Amelie, Sam, Fragile, and the extinction he believed was coming, Higgs is ultimately left facing something far smaller, his own ending. And for once, he isn't the one who gets to decide what it means. Maybe Higgs is right about one thing. Everything ends, people die, relationships disappear, countries fall apart. And eventually humanity itself may longer exist. But Death Stranding never really asks us you to pretend otherwise. Instead, it asks what we're going to do with the time before that ending arrives. Fragile chooses to save people even when doing so permanently scars her. Sam continues making deliveries even though another delivery will always be waiting. People continue reaching for one another even though every connection they create can eventually be lost. And Higgs looks at the fact that none of it lasts forever and eventually decides that if it makes the struggle meaningless, maybe that's the tragedy underneath the golden mask. Not that Higgs was wrong about death, but that somewhere along the way, he began believing death had the authority to decide what life was worth. And once he accepted that, extinction didn't simply become something Higgs believed was coming. It became something that gave him purpose, something that gave him power, something that made him feel chosen. Until eventually Higgs found himself there, on a beach, no longer looking down at humanity from the edge of his extinction, but facing the consequences of the choices he made while trying to become part of it. And underneath the golden mask was never some incomprehensible monster. It was Higgs Monaghan, a porter, a survivor, a man who knew what it meant to feel powerless, a man who was given extraordinary power and allowed it to confirm what he had already begun to fear about the world, and someone who became so convinced that everything would eventually end that he stopped believing there was meaning in what happened before it did. Maybe that's why Higgs works so well opposite Sam. Neither man can stop death. Neither man can promise that the connections they make will last forever. Neither man can guarantee humanity a future. The difference is that Sam keeps reaching for one anyway, and Higgs stopped. Thank you so much for watching. If this story resonated with you, and you've been enjoying these narrative dives, I set up a small Ko-fi page connected to Beyond Waking Realm. There's absolutely no pressure. It's simply there for anyone who'd like to help support what I'm continuing to build here. I also love to hear your thoughts. What part of Higgs Monaghan's journey resonated with you the most? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until our next story, more stories await.